Hundreds of candidates, office holders, and their surrogates have campaigned for support and votes from the back of trains, at railroad stations, and trackside rallies across the country. Welcome to the Whistle Stop Politics podcast. I'm Edward Siegel, author of the best-selling book, Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them. In each episode of this podcast, experts share anecdotes, stories, and items about whistle-stopping politicians and their role in this important but almost forgotten part of American political history. As a campaign train historian and collector of whistle-stop memorabilia, I know how challenging it can be to find campaign train-related items, such as buttons, maps, photos, posters, press credentials, and even advertisements. The good news is that some of these hard-to-find examples are in the collections of the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. My guest today is Claire Jerry, who is a curator of political history at the museum. She'll discuss some of the campaign train-related items in the museum's collections. For those of you who are listening to the show, you can see the memorabilia that she'll be talking about on the YouTube version of this interview. Welcome to Whistle Stop Politics, Claire.
It's great to be with you, Edward.
Tell us about your background, your responsibilities, and the mission of the National Museum of American History.
I'm a curator of political history at the National Museum of American History, which is one of the 21 parts of the Smithsonian Institution. And our museum's mission is to empower people to create a just and compassionate future by exploring, preserving, and sharing the complexity of our past. Now, we do this based on a collection of about 1.7 million objects. My responsibilities in the Division of Political History to support this mission, including helping to preserve and interpret the history of the presidency and 20th and 21st century political campaigning, including going into the field to collect the current campaign, which I've already done several times this year. My educational background includes graduate degrees in rhetoric and communication, including the study of American public address, and in U.S. history and public history. I want to say a little bit about public history. It's a field which takes history beyond the classroom into museums, historic sites, film and television, historic preservation, and many other places. It's really what we're about at the National Museum. Now, before coming to the Smithsonian, I spent many years teaching at the college level and working in other museums, including the Paul Finley Congressional Office Museum, the McKissick Museum at the University of South Carolina, and as a guest curator at the Harry Truman Library and Museum. So I've been working with political history for a long time, but nothing like the collection I get to work with now. In our division alone, we have about 170,000 political objects, from George Washington and before to objects I collected just this week. Most of our historic items come to us through donation. We don't really have a federally funded collecting budget, so we rely on individuals and families who, in their own life, recognized the historic significance of something and kept it in their family, or perhaps they were a collector themselves, and then they realize that maybe they have something that belongs in the national collection to tell the story to everyone. And so they contact us, and we look at what they have and match it up to what we already have in the collection. When we go out into the field for contemporary items, we're looking for things that remind us of what we've seen from past campaigns, and also looking for things that might suggest what's unique about a particular moment in time. So we do it both ways.
What items are you looking to add to the museum's collections?
When I'm out in the field at primaries in particular, we're looking for buttons and posters. Sometimes campaigns will make what we call gimmicks or novelties, like a cozy to put your soda can in or something like that. We're looking for things that are commercially produced by campaigns that you would see in a lot of places, but we're also looking for posters that maybe individuals made at home to bring with them to that event. We look at T-shirts and caps, bumper stickers. Came back with some of the flyers that might show up in your mail, for example. And we're also looking for material that's produced by election commissions, sort of explaining the voting process. We like to see if we can get I voted stickers or sample ballots of places. And a lot of polling places which we visit will have on the wall explanations of how to register to vote. And so we collect that material to show how the voting process has also changed over time.
Well, I've had the good fortune to visit the museum several times over the years, and I know there's not a lot of space to display the items. What percentage of the items that you have in political history are you actually able to display in the museum?
Most museums, and I would say we're pretty typical, display between 1 and 3% of their objects on the floor at any given time. We also are able to rotate objects. Things got a little messed up with the pandemic, as they did in lots of businesses, but that's probably a pretty good average. And then we're really trying to increase the number of objects that we have available to people digitally. And your listeners can also go to some of our museum and Smithsonian websites to see more of the collections there.
Well, let's delve into the topic at hand, and that's campaign train related items in your collection. In 1896, Democratic presidential candidate William Jennings Bryan became the first national office seeker to conduct what was an early version of what later became the modern whistle stop campaign train tour. He campaigned by rail for about 18,000 miles over the course of 100 days and delivered 600 speeches at hundreds of train depots in 27 states. And he was seen and heard by about 5 million people. Claire, tell us about the Bryan related items that you have from his 1896 run for the White House.
I am so always glad when I get to start any conversation with William Jennings Bryan. I lived for many years in Illinois. My first museum job was at William Jennings Bryan's alma mater. And as somebody who studies campaign speech making, you can't get any better than William Jennings Bryan. Not only did he speak a lot, as you just told us, but he's known for having been one of the finest, if not the finest political orator of his day. So I really love the 1896 campaign. And I'm also like it as somebody who collects and studies campaign memorabilia, because 1896 is really seen as something of a turning point in the production of campaign objects. I tell my colleagues that I think the 20th century started in 1896. Technological changes, particularly the invention of celluloid, contributed to the creation of objects we would recognize today. And also, there are people who say that 1896 had somewhere between 2,500 and 3,000 different objects created for the Bryan and the McKinley campaign, McKinley being the Republican nominee. And they started to look similar to what we see today. Buttons that were red, white, and blue, that had references to policy. Economic policy was the big campaign issue in 1896. And also pictures of the candidates. Now, that wasn't new. There had been different kinds of photographic technology before. But it's a nice way to start talking about Bryan, because he knew he wasn't really a national figure. He'd been in the House for a little while, but it wasn't like everybody in the country knew him or knew what he looked like. And so he really wanted his face to be on a lot of objects. So we have his face on buttons and on toys and even on something called a rosette, which you would attach to the bridle of your saddle. So people who saw you riding in the park, I guess, could see who you were supporting for president. So unfortunately, at the museum, we don't have any items related specifically to his whistle stop tour. But we have, as I said, buttons, watch fobs. Watch fobs of the day were really quite beautiful, luggage tags. And as I said, I'm a rhetoric person. And because he won the nomination with the speech he gave at the Democratic National Convention, not an acceptance speech. He wasn't the nominee yet, and nominees didn't speak at conventions then. But he gave a platform speech that we now know as the Cross of Gold. So we have several items, buttons and posters, that either have quotations from the speech on it or images of a cross of gold, a crown of thorns that would have been immediately recognizable to people at the time. And those are some of my favorite 1896 things.
The fact that he campaigned so extensively, is it unusual that there's really no items, whistle stop related items from those tours? I know, and I include in my book, on my website, uh, pictures of him campaigning from the back of trains, political cartoons. Are these items from his campaign train tours? Are they're like hen's teeth? They're just impossible to find.
That may be true. And I'm honestly I don't know about things that might have been intentionally produced today because we have this tradition of whistle stop campaigning. Locations will produce items promoting their town. Campaigns will produce items. But as you said, it was a new thing in Bryan's day. And so I think he might have been a little bit ahead of the curve on what would make a good object to speak to a whistle stop campaign. So if they're out there, I'm really not familiar with them.
Well, when I find them, I'll let you know.
I hope so.
Let's move ahead a few years to Harry Truman, 1948. President Truman went on several whistle stop campaign train tours during his underdog campaign for the White House in 1948. Indeed, he thought that his campaign train tours actually helped him win the election against the favored candidate, Republican Thomas Dewey. But many people may not know that 1948 wasn't the first time that Truman campaigned by train. In fact, he used the same tactic when he ran for vice president in 1944 as FDR's running mate, and then again in 1952 when he campaigned for Adlai Stevenson, who ran for president against Republican Dwight Eisenhower. What items does the museum have from Truman's 1948 race for the White House, Claire?
As is true with all the campaigns that we might discuss, we have wonderful collection of buttons and posters. In Truman's case, for whatever reason, we have a couple of interesting, more personal items, a tropical shirt that he wore at his Florida little White House that he signed, and a White House bowling pin, but those weren't campaign specific. But in Truman's case, unlike that first Bryan campaign, we do have a few items associated with the Whistle Stop Tour. We have some editorial cartoons, some of them original, donated to us by the cartoonist, him or herself. But for 48, what we have is a really lovely book that the Washington Star newspaper put out with all of their political cartoons from 1948. And there's some great cartoons in there of Truman, largely accusing him of talking about everything from the back of the train except his policies. They were really sort of trying to point out that maybe that's not what was going on the Whistle Stop Tour. Now, an object that I really love, though, from the 1948 Whistle Stop isn't particularly interesting to look at. It's a mimeographed 4 sheets of paper stapled together. It's a copy of a press release that the Truman people put out in advance of the Whistle Stop Tour. So it's a pre-release schedule. And it essentially lists what they anticipate will be the itinerary. Now, there are some handwritten notations on it. Clearly not everything that happened that they thought was going to happen happened. But what is really amazing, it's an itinerary from September 28th through October 11th of 48. And it shows that on many of those days, he was giving 12, 15, or even more speeches. And we know that not only was that demanding for Truman, but he expected his staff to give him some local color for each one of those speeches. So a local story or the name of a local politician or someone who might be joining him on the platform. So they were working really hard to produce those speeches. And when you see a photograph of him giving one of them, it's interesting. But when you see that he did it over and over and over again, you realize what a daunting experience it was.
Well, let's move ahead for a few more years and talk about Adlai Stevenson. He campaigned by train when he ran for president in the 1950s. He actually wrote his own speeches that he delivered from the back of his train, but he didn't like to give the same speech twice to different audiences. What materials do you have from Stevenson's campaign train tours?
We just have a couple of things. We have one small broadside. We have 2 copies of that. It's basically a flyer announcing that he was coming. It's pretty small. It's 5.5 by 8.5 inches. And in this case, it has a drawing of an old style train. It would not look like the train Stevenson was going to pull in on. And it was inviting the citizens of Silver Spring to the station for the Stevenson Whistle Stop on Friday, October 31st at 10 a.m. And it says it's going to happen rain or shine. And the final line is, everybody come. And we have 2 of those. Now, the second object, the different object we have related to Stevenson actually relates, as you said, to President Harry Truman. Having decided not to seek re-election himself in 52, Truman eventually threw himself into supporting Stevenson and took his own short whistle stop tour, as you said. We have a menu from that tour that's entitled Trip of the President on the B&O Railroad from October 21st, 22nd, and 23rd of 1952. And our copy of the menu is actually signed by President Truman.
Moving ahead a little bit further in time to Dwight Eisenhower, he campaigned by train in 1952 in his first run for the White House. But because of health-related issues, he didn't go on a whistle-stop tour when he sought re-election 4 years later. By the 1950s, of course, some presidential candidates had turned to buses and airplanes as more effective ways to run for office. I understand, Clary, that the museum has a rather unusual item from Eisenhower's 1952 whistle-top train tour. What can you tell me about that?
It's probably our single best whistle-stop specific item. As you said, in 52, Eisenhower traveled 50,000 miles to deliver over 200 speeches on a train he called the Look Ahead Neighbor Special. And while speaking from the rear platform, as people would have done before, there were mounted microphones on the edge of the platform. And we have a set of these microphones that were actually donated to the museum by President Eisenhower himself. He believed that these whistle stops enhanced his image, which I think is a really fascinating thing to think about. He was probably one of the best known people in the United States, won the war in Europe, and yet he believed he needed to enhance his image as a political leader and actually be seen by more people. And he thought these whistle stops helped him do that. And the memory must have been a good one for him because the microphones that he gave to us eventually, he kept in his study until January of 1961. And he had them mounted. They would have been mounted, I think, directly or attached somehow by the networks to the train. These have been attached to a plastic base, and there's a small inscribed plate that's been added that says this: the Eisenhower Victory Microphones, a memento of a 50,000-mile campaign tour beginning September 4th, 1952 to November 4th, 1952, National Broadcast Company. And it's a great object all by itself, but having that backstory about how much they meant to him, that he kept them in a place where he could see them while he was working for essentially the rest of his political career.
Wow. Has that microphone ever been displayed at any of the Smithsonian museums?
It was displayed at one time in our presidency, our American presidency exhibit. And I had hoped to include it in an exhibit on the rhetoric of political campaigning, but I had the only exhibit in my museum that was canceled because of the pandemic. So it hasn't been on display recently.
Are there any plans to display it in the future?
We are getting ready to do some redesigning of our presidency exhibit. So everything is back on the table. And because of my interest in rhetoric, I certainly hope that this is something that we can get back on the floor.
Well, last but not least is Lady Bird Johnson. She was the first wife of a candidate to campaign by train. She went on her history-making tour of the South on behalf of her husband, Lyndon Baines Johnson.
As it turns out, the Lady Bird collection, whistle stop collection, is the largest we have and the best we have related to whistle stops. Most people around Johnson believe that his campaign needed a little boost in the South for things like his support of civil rights. And Lady Bird also believed that as a Southern woman, she could be persuasive in a different way, that newspaper editors or local elected officials might not want to meet with her husband, but they wouldn't be able to turn down a Southern lady. And so her whistle stop tour included not only speeches from the back of the platform, but also luncheons and other forms of meet and greet. So our Lady Bird special collection includes a postcard that has a little drawing of a train showing the whole route of the train. There are whistles that were distributed to the crowds, matchbooks, very common campaign giveaway in the 1960s, a hat that's designed to look like an old style conductor's hat. We have a pennant, we have some balloons, campaign flyers for LBJ that of course were distributed, buttons, menus, and my favorite, a toy locomotive that's about 18 inches long that was used as a centerpiece at one of those luncheons. And it's a great collection that tells so many wonderful stories. It can not only tell stories about whistle stop campaigning, but it can tell stories about the role of first ladies in their husbands' administrations and campaigns. It can show how regional interests can intersect and change presidential campaigning. It can be used to talk about the involvement of local officials. Not to mention, there's a lot of great women's history wrapped up in that Lady Bird special collection. It's one of our best.
I'm a member of the American Political Items Collectors, and I know a lot of my colleagues in that organization collect Lady Bird Johnson special items. Are there any plans to display those materials anytime soon at the museum?
Actually, a lot of those are on display right now in our First Ladies Gallery. The way our First Ladies Gallery is set up, one section of it features different First Ladies from different time periods. And right now, there is a case on Lady Bird Johnson that features not only her inaugural gown, which people expect to see, but a number of things, including the train centerpiece. So I would say that those members need to get out to the museum in the next year or so. I think that they will be on for at least another year.
Well, I'll definitely be there soon. I'm afraid, though, that we're almost out of time today. Before we end, is there anything else you'd like to share with us about the political history collection at the museum or other campaign train related items that we haven't discussed?
We have a few things in our collection from the 1908 campaign between William Jennings Bryan again and William Howard Taft. Mostly they are photographs from Leslie's Weekly Illustrated, showing them on trains. I love it because they talk about Taft campaigning in the West, by which they meant Indiana and Wisconsin, just not how we would define the West. We have a button from a Ronald Reagan whistle stop in Ohio in 1984 and a beautiful poster from Bill Clinton's 1996 21st Century Express that took him to the Democratic National Convention. And as I said before, we rely on the generosity of families and donors, and I would love to hear more about whistle stop memorabilia. I love the way that the trains intersect with presidential oratory, and so it's one of my favorite parts of our collection.
Well, if any of my colleagues from the American Political Items Collectors or anyone else who collects political memorabilia, especially train related items, if they have them and want to share, and how do they contact you?
I can be reached at the Smithsonian. My website, my email address there is jerryc@si.edu. Or if they want to contact the museum directly, there's an inquiry website that you can go to and put in your question, and it'll get forwarded to me.
Well, thanks, Claire, for being with me today on the Whistle Stop Politics podcast.
Well, you're very welcome, Edward, and thank you so much for having me on your show.
My guest today was Claire Jerry, who is a curator of political history at the Smithsonian's National Museum of American History in Washington, D.C. That's it for this episode of Whistle Stop Politics. Come back next time for more anecdotes and stories about the history of campaign trains in American politics. Or subscribe to the show wherever you get your podcasts. You can learn more about my book, Whistle Stop Politics, Campaign Trains and the Reporters Who Covered Them, by going to whistlestoppolitics.com.